The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is my least favorite 3D Zelda game. And before I get started, I should probably say that if you like this game, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to completely trash on people for saying that this game is good or that this game is amazing. It probably should be mentioned that I, of course, did not grow up with this game. When I first played it, I was 15 years old and liked some of the intro parts, but the more that I played the game, the more that I didn't enjoy it. And now, playing through it and actually beating it, I can say that that perspective of 15-year-old Noah still kind of holds true to this day. This game has a relatively interesting opening, but everything just feels like it gets worse over time, which isn't necessarily ideal. So, without further ado, let's get started in talking about The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword and what works, and especially what doesn't work with this game. To begin, for my own sake, we will be playing the Switch version and not the Wii version. I absolutely despise the motion controls of the original Wii version, and so it's probably a good thing that the Switch version released. And speaking of the Switch version, I gotta say, I don't know that this game was fully optimized to work with button controls. And that's not to say that the sword motions don't work, because they do, but it's a little weird having to move around the camera while holding the L button. I almost would prefer that you hold the L button to swing around the sword because, I mean, it's almost like you're holding the sword and then swinging it around with the joystick. It's kind of interactive, but it's not like you need to hold yourself in place just to look around. I don't know, that's just kind of a small thing. But another thing that I don't really like is that the enemies, you can tell, were built around motion controls. All of the combat encounters were built around the perspective that you're just going to be swinging around the Wiimote. And when you transfer that to a joystick, it's very easy to spam enemies. And when there's enemies that go against your spam, it's very easy to just easily die from them, which happened to me a ton in Linear Desert. And well, eventually I figured out a decent solution to this. It's something that's present throughout the game and just makes me feel like motion controls were made for this game, to the point where just using button controls doesn't work as well as it should. But also, this game's gameplay is kind of weird for me because it has the exact same problem that Twilight Princess had, which is the fact that this game takes forever to beat. This game in many ways overstays its welcome, and the adventure feels even longer than what it is in Twilight Princess. And while this game is technically just a little bit shorter than Twilight Princess, it feels like this grandiose adventure that just is all over the place, which doesn't really work for me. But let me explain what I mean in a second. Another thing in this game that tons of people have already poked fun of, but of course I also don't like, is Fi. Now, I've played through every Zelda game at this point, which is kind of crazy to say out loud, but through all of the Zelda companions, I gotta say, she is my least favorite. Even though they cut so much of her dialogue in the Switch version, she still is so annoying, because so much of her information not only has basically no personality, but also I don't really care, or it's information that's like, yeah, I can tell. For example, she always gives you a report when you're in a brand new area, and the report just tells information that if you simply look around, you will be well aware of. And this is just kind of information that feels unnecessary. And while I get that Link is supposed to be visiting these places for the first time, it just kind of feels silly to have to explain this to the player. I don't really like it at all. Also, this is another nitpick, but I really don't like the terminology that this game uses. Now, I get that this was a Wii game, but sometimes it feels like it's almost too centered for children, such as the "keep adventuring" moniker every time you get a game over, which in my opinion is just silly. Not to mention that this game breaks the traditional Zelda lineage of starting with 3 hearts and instead starts with 6, and I believe quarter hearts don't exist. And I don't know if this was just because, oh, the little kid isn't going to understand what a quarter heart means or something like that, but it just feels off. I don't really know how else to explain it. But also the fact that you can get plenty of hearts in this game, so I mean, starting with 3 hearts just would have been fine. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. But another thing with Skyward Sword that is a little weird to me is that, well, it does feel a little kid-centered in that way. It also is supposed to be the origin story for the Zelda franchise, which is something that many Zelda fans were wanting for a long time up to this point. But, I mean, someone playing this game for the first time isn't going to understand any of these references. And, well, it kind of works out. I don't really know that it's a perfect comparison, because the hardcore Zelda fans not really are seeing this one as something revolutionary and crazy, and the little kid Zelda fans might be a little bit confused. So yeah, that's just something I noticed. But I would say one of my other biggest critiques of this game has to be its story and plot. You see, something that's original about Skyward Sword is its plot and story, and the fact that it's supposed to be an origin story for the rest of the Zelda timeline, which up to this point was only loosely connected. In fact, Hyrule Historia would come out right alongside Skyward Sword, and I gotta say, the idea of an origin story for Zelda isn't actually the worst thing in the world. In fact, I kind of like it. However, the problem comes with the fact that Skyward Sword just is so convoluted plot-wise. One of my least favorite elements in the entire game is the use of time travel, and not just the concept of time travel in and of itself, but just the fact that this is a reused concept from so many other Zelda games. I mean, think about it, so many Zelda games have already used time travel in them. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Oracle of Ages, all of those games use time travel, and after Majora's Mask, I kind of got sick of it. So bringing it back for Skyward Sword, yeah, I wasn't the biggest fan of that either. But also the plot just feels so convoluted. While Zelda is trying to do her best to figure out her role as the chosen goddess by Hylia, it just feels like Link is just kind of there sometimes. I mean, I get that you are supposed to be the hero that's guarding the princess, but you're just chasing her around for the first 3 dungeons, and then eventually you go on kind of a side quest tangent, but these are actually main quest. And also, not to mention the Imprisoned, who is probably one of my least favorite boss fights in all of Zelda history, and you have to maintain him in his seal. There's just a lot in this game, and there's a lot of antagonists too, to the point where the game just feels very confusing, and I get that that's kind of the point. I mean, you're supposed to be new to this world, and the antagonists are also supposed to be like, oh, we finally got them out of the sky, but I mean, it just doesn't really feel natural, and I've never felt that way with any other Zelda game. And by the end of it, the Demon Lord Demise comes out and turns Giraham into his sword, and then we have the final boss fight, which I gotta say is probably one of the lamest in all of Zelda history. This final boss fight just doesn't really excite me like many others do all across the series' history. And while the dialogue before and after it is certainly iconic, I mean, saying that a moment is iconic just because of the dialogue, in my opinion, is a little silly. But I will say that Skyward Sword does have a fair amount of iconic moments, whether it's Demise's monologue at the end of the game, or Zelda turning the Goddess Sword finally into the Master Sword. There's just a lot of interesting stuff going on. And of course, the end of the game, creating the realm of Hyrule. So Skyward Sword is kind of a mixed bag for me some days, and some days I'll admit, I don't actually think it's half bad. But other days, I go back and play it, and the gameplay just is so exhausting to me. There are so many moments in this game that just feel like a complete slog. And this game certainly overstates its welcome in just how long it is. And I know that I said that for both Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess, and yes, I'm not opposed to long games. but I also feel like if a game is going to be that long, it has to justify that length. For example, Breath of the Wild, I feel like more than justifies its length, and we'll get to that in a future video. But Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess, not so much. And as a result, Skyward Sword just kind of falls flat for me. Instead of being this wonderful magnum opus for the series, in the fact that it is an origin story, it just doesn't work. But the last thing that I have to bring up is the biggest critique of Skyward Sword without a doubt, the linearity. And honestly, I don't really blame the Zelda team for going all linear here, because if you remember in Twilight Princess, maybe one of my least favorite things about that game was the open world aspects of it, because it had this big giant world with almost nothing to do in it. In fact, the more linear portions of that game I actually liked a little bit more. So up to this point, a lot of these Zelda games had open worlds, but I mean, it wasn't really that exciting to explore them. So going linear here, I mean, it kind of makes sense. And honestly, I don't hate the idea, but the execution just kind of falls flat once again. Skyward Sword just doesn't really excite me with its innovations in gameplay, and a lot of these missions in between dungeons are just really annoying. Having to find a bunch of panels to put your sword in the middle of the desert is not entertaining. Having to go through spotlights just so that you're not caught is not entertaining. Trying to drowse through different locations to find keys to go through a keyhole, again, is not entertaining. The drowsing mechanic is such an interesting idea, but it doesn't work in this game. And in fact, I kind of like how the scent was with the wolf and Twilight Princess a lot more. And of course, the mechanic was used once again in Breath of the Wild, where I would argue it's at its best. It's a good idea, but the execution of it just, again, isn't my favorite. Skyward Sword is like this in many ways, from the bug collection, which in turn should be a good idea, but I don't feel inclined to collect any of these things, to the slow upgrade of your sword, which in turn should be a good idea, but I mean, It's weird to say, but Skyward Sword was ahead of its time in many ways, but I wouldn't really call that a good thing. I feel like much of Skyward Sword's design, it's weird to say this, but for the portions that are too far into the past, it hurts the game. For the portions that are too far into the future, it again hurts the game. I feel like this game is at its best when it's just trying to do its own thing. The origin story mechanic at the beginning is actually really nice, and I really like exploring Skyloft. The side missions there are so cool. But when the game is trying to be a Zelda game, ironically enough, that's kind of when I like it the least. So yeah, Skyward Sword is kind of a weird game to review. While I like the overall concepts of the game, sometimes I wouldn't really call the execution perfect. In fact, I would argue that the execution was far from perfect. But I will say that I probably enjoyed a little bit more of this game than I hated. So maybe it's around a 6 out of 10, 5 out of 10. Honestly, I'm not really sure. Let's just go with 6 out of 10. I'll be nice today.